Is it time to say goodbye to tipping? As dissatisfaction grows and questions about fairness arise, a movement against tipping gains momentum, challenging the traditional practice of rewarding service workers. But will eliminating tipping really lead to fairer wages for all? Elevate your finances with WealthWise Insider, wisdom for wealth builders. Welcome back to the channel, viewers. In this video, we delve into the debate over tipping. Should it stay or should it go? Tipping has become a hassle. People feel pressured to give big tips, even for small things like takeout or a coffee. And it's not just restaurants anymore. Now you're expected to tip at places like barbershops, car washes, and even when using services like Uber. This doesn't always make sense because sometimes you're just paying for the service itself, not necessarily exceptional service. It's especially frustrating because prices keep going up due to inflation. We're not saying service workers shouldn't be paid fairly, but it would be better if their wages were included in the upfront price. This would make it clearer for customers and ensure a steadier income for the workers. Many other countries do it this way, like France and Denmark, where a standard service fee is included in the bill. Some places like Japan and South Korea don't even have a tipping culture because it's seen as rude. In the US, the minimum wage for service workers is ridiculously low, just $2.13 per hour. How did tipping become such a burden for customers and a necessity for workers, instead of just a way to show appreciation for great service? Looking back, tipping wasn't always a thing in the United States, but it's been around since the mid-1800s. Contrary to popular belief, the idea that tip stands for to ensure promptness is just a myth. Actually, tipping was something wealthy Americans picked up while traveling in Europe. In Europe, tipping originated as a custom between masters and servants during the Middle Ages. Masters would give extra money to servants for good service. When Americans saw this, they brought the practice back home. For them, tipping was a way to show off their status and wealth. But tipping didn't catch on easily in America. Many people saw it as reinforcing social divides and class distinctions. It seemed like the rich were flaunting their money over those less fortunate. Plus, it seemed unfair to expect middle and lower class people to tip on top of already expensive bills. Interestingly, this American resistance to tipping influenced Europe as well, which is why tipping isn't as common there. However, after the Civil War in the US, attitudes towards tipping changed. While slavery was abolished, many freed slaves ended up in service jobs where tipping was expected. Businesses saw this as a way to avoid paying former slaves proper wages, since they could earn money through tips. So tipping went from being a status symbol to a moral issue. Not tipping was seen as indirectly supporting slavery. Even if people were against slavery, they felt obligated to tip, regardless of their financial situation. This shift in perspective made tipping feel more like a burden than a choice. While tipping was becoming popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s, not everyone was on board. Many people, including some local governments, were against it. Georgia, for instance, saw tips as essentially bribes, which they didn't want to encourage. In 1915, 6 states even banned tipping, which seems reasonable. However, instead of implementing a minimum wage to support workers, these states punished the workers themselves. Iowa, for example, said workers who accepted tips could be fined or jailed. Thankfully, the courts intervened, but no better solution was proposed, so things went back to how they were. Congress made things worse with the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. While it set a federal minimum wage and banned child labor, it excluded tipped workers. This continued with the tip credit in 1966, allowing restaurants to pay a lower wage as long as tips made up the difference. Over time, the minimum wage for tipped workers stayed low, at $2.13 per hour in many places. Despite these policies hurting service workers, there wasn't much public protest. This was partly because the demographics of service jobs were changing. More white people were working in these roles, reducing racial tensions around tipping. Additionally, many service workers actually prefer the tipping system. With a younger workforce, stability wasn't as big a concern, and they were willing to gamble on tips rather than a fixed wage. Even though statistically a minimum wage would be better, many service workers still prefer tipping. It's no longer just about appreciation or fighting slavery. It's about maximizing earnings for both businesses and workers, shaping the current landscape of tipping. Believe it or not, there's a whole scientific field dedicated to understanding why people tip and how to get bigger tips. Research suggests waiters should do things like introduce themselves, repeat orders, give compliments, and use customers' names. But these are just small factors. The real game changer in tipping culture is technology. With cards, people are willing to spend much more than with cash, up to 83% more in some cases. That's why the average card purchase is much higher than the average cash purchase. But the highest influence on tipping is those iPad payment terminals. Not only are you using a card instead of cash, but the terminals also make tipping super easy. They suggest high minimum tip percentages, making it awkward to choose a lower amount. Plus, everyone waiting in line sees what you're tipping, adding pressure to tip more. Traditionally, tips were left on the table, so customers could honestly reflect on the service. But with these terminals, you're forced to decide in front of everyone. This design puts pressure on customers to tip, and it's all intentional. Service industries have figured out how to use technology and peer pressure to get bigger tips, but it's leaving customers feeling tired and frustrated. Given all this information, it's not surprising to hear that there's a growing movement against tipping. These individuals argue that tipping isn't about showing appreciation. It's about compensating for low wages. After all, you don't tip professionals like pilots, lawyers, accountants, or doctors who provide valuable services. This suggests that tipping is more about knowing the worker isn't paid fairly rather than genuine appreciation for their service. The anti-tipping camp believes that if service workers were paid better wages, tipping culture could be eliminated. However, pro-tippers disagree. They think getting rid of tipping would allow businesses to increase prices, affecting both dine-in and takeout customers. Nevertheless, other countries have maintained without tipping, so there might be merit to this argument. Ultimately, whether you're for or against tipping, only time will tell how this debate plays out. So, are you team anti-tip or team pro-tip? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to WealthWise Insider for further discussions and its impact on financial dynamics. Until then, keep informed. Wise tips, prosperous paths.